Greetings and welcome to the video on outcomes of statistical tests. Let me get a marker here and get this on our canvas. So we're going to talk in this video about outcomes of statistical tests. And the way we do this is we use what's called decision error typology. And so the name of this big box that I've drawn here is called a decision error typology. It's a 2x2 typology box. Okay, so let's get some things labeled here. So when we're setting up kind of what we're talking about here, the columns are going to kind of represent what is true in the population. So let's try that again. What is true in the population? Well, you remember we're doing inferential statistics here. So we're taking our sample from a population, running our statistics, and any differences that we find between our groups, we want to infer back to the population. And the population hasn't been tested, right? And so what we don't know is there could be two truths that are in the population. Either my treatment will have an effect, and I'll put that one to the right here. Treatment has an effect, and that's going to be this column. Or treatment has no effect. This left column. And we never really know what is the true condition or the real situation of the null hypothesis. So when we think about this, when I say what is true in the population, another way of saying this is what is the real situation of the null in that population. It can either be that the treatment has an effect in the population or it doesn't have an effect. And then these rows then are going to represent the conclusion reached in the study that you conducted. And what are the different conclusions? Your study can say no effect, or your study can say treatment has effect. Okay. Now, as we get into this, the logics, it probably will overwhelm you. It overwhelmed me when I learned it. It overwhelms all students. So I would encourage you to go back and rewatch this and re-listen to it as many times as you need to. I'll do this and explain this a couple of different ways. And so when we're saying, when your conclusion of the study, that the conclusion reached in your study, this right here, when you get no effect, what are you saying when you have no effect? No effect means that you failed to reject. And if you fail to reject, we're saying you're not going to challenge the validity of that null hypothesis. And if there's no effect here in the actual population, then you have made a correct decision. The probability of this decision, P, is actually equal to 1 minus the alpha level that you set. Okay? Okay, just hang in there with me. However, if the conclusion of your study was that the treatment has an effect, so we're down here now, the treatment now has an effect, but there's no effect in the actual population, you're saying there was an effect when there is really no effect in the population, then you have made an error, and we call that error a type 1 error. And we protect against this statistically with a probability equal to the alpha level that you choose. Okay, let's move over to the right-hand column. If the conclusion reached in your study was that there was no effect, in other words, you failed to reject, but your treatment does have an effect in the population, then you're actually making an error again. And so in other words, your conclusion, the study that you conducted, you're saying no effect, I failed to reject, I'm not going to challenge the null, but in the population, the treatment really is having an effect on the population. You're making an error again, but we call this error a type 2 error, and we protect against that with a probability that we set equal to beta. I'm not really particularly interested that you know what the values for beta can be at this particular point in time. All right, but if the conclusion reached in your study that the treatment has an effect, so again, we're down here, treatment has an effect, and in a population the treatment has an effect, then you're making a correct decision, and the probability of this is 1 minus beta. And we call this, by the way, the power of our statistical test. 1 minus beta is the power of our statistical test. All right, so let's just go and maybe kind of, think of just analyze this from a different perspective. When we say no effect, we're saying fail or reject. When we're saying the treatment has an effect, we're going to reject or challenge the condition of the null. Okay, so another way of thinking about this is what we call kind of the legal or the courtroom scenario. So I'm going to explain to you through the courtroom scenario. So just as you have somebody that comes into the courtroom that and you're trying a case on their behalf, you never really know whether or not the defendant is in fact guilty or true, or guilty or true. You never really know whether in fact the defendant is guilty of the crime or not, right? And that's the same thing as saying here, are they innocent or guilty? So when you think of what is true in the population, let me switch to a different color here. What is true in the population? This is kind of equivalent to saying, is the defendant innocent or guilty? And you never really know whether or not you're sending a guilty person to jail, or whether or not you're convicting an innocent person of a crime. You really never know that. So it's this is the same thing here. We're going to draw the same analog. So the treatment has no effect. This is saying kind of like you're innocent, and the treatment has an effect. This is kind of saying you're kind of guilty. And so it's the same thing down here. When the conclusion reached by the study, conclusion reached by the jury can say no effect, it's innocent. Or if they reject the null, it's like saying you're guilty. Just making an analogy here. And so if your study finds no effect, and in fact the true condition in the population was no effect, it's like you have an innocent hypothesis, and that hypothesis you have an innocent conclusion, and the conclusion in the population is innocent. To innocence is a correct decision. If the conclusion in your study was innocent, but the condition in the population was guilty, in other words, that the treatment has an effect, then you've actually made an error. You failed to do what? You failed to find somebody guilty. They were really guilty. You said they were innocent, the conclusion of your research study, and we call that a type 2 error. Okay, so when you're studying, this is important, and I'll come down here and talk about rejecting the null. But when the outcome of your study is failing to reject, i.e. you got a p-value that was greater than 0.05, you're not going to challenge the validity of the null mathematical expression. Then only one of two things can be true. You either made a correct decision or you're making a type 2 error. Okay, so only one of those two things can be true. Now let's go down here and talk about if the treatment has an effect, then you're saying I want to reject the null, I want to challenge the null, I want to say that the null is guilty. However, if there's no effect in the population, then what we're doing, we're sending, we're basically trying to send a guilty person, an innocent person to jail. You never want to send an innocent person to jail. That's the most heinous of the errors that you can make as a jury, and so we call that the type 1 error. So failing to convict a guilty person, type 2 error, and sending an innocent person to jail, type 1 error. However, if you reject the null, when you're saying that want to challenge the null, and in fact the treatment is having an effect in the population here, then you made again a correct decision. So putting this in context yet again, if the treatment has an effect, i.e. you're rejecting the null, the only two things that can occur is that you've either made a type 1 error, which you're protecting against with your alpha level, or you've made a correct decision. Again, the logic of this is somewhat convoluted. I would really encourage you to go back and listen to this video a couple of times to make sure that you understand I guess the binary outcomes that can happen if you fail to reject, and the binary outcomes that can happen if you reject, and the fact that you're going to come to a conclusion in your research study, but you really never know what the true condition is in the population related to that null. So again, rewatch the video a couple of times. Make sure you kind of understand this 2x2 typology table. That's it. Thanks for watching the video.